Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Nick. Nick, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm an evolutionary biologist, an ecologist, and I'm currently working at the University of Florida. I'm interested in all things animals and plants and how they live their lives, and particularly how animals and plants respond to environmental variation. So I do a little bit of teaching, I do a lot of research, and quite a bit of math.
Where do you see the biggest reaction? Obviously, is it animals that react differently to their environment, or would it be plants? I feel like it's probably more noticeable for the general public or a scientist or researcher in animals, just because you can actually see a reaction. But I feel like plants do something at such a level that we just don't perceive with our eyes. We have to use more of instruments to be able to perceive that.
Yeah, so they both respond quite strongly, but in different ways. And so it's really obvious with animals if you look at some of the most conspicuous examples. It's like animals that migrate in the winter, right? We have birds that fly thousands of miles to get away from the cold and the and the freezing temperatures up north. But here in Florida, in my backyard, I can find all kinds of things that respond, all kinds of other animals that respond to simple changes in the weather during the day. So like the lizards come and hang out and they bask in the sun when it's cold outside, just try and get some energy. And so the behavior normally determines where they move when the environment changes. For plants, they have the problem where they can't move. Most plants can't move. And so they have to do it in different ways. And the obvious thing that we all pay attention to as humans is plants lose all their leaves in the winter. So that's the equivalent of migration. They go dormant and they hang out. They lose all their leaves, a bunch of trees do. And they don't do normal plant things. They don't photosynthesize. They don't move any water because it's just a bad time to be a plant. And then they all leaf out in the spring and they make these beautiful flowers. I was just in North Carolina, and there's all kinds of wonderful spring things that are happening there right now. And that's kind of how plants respond to the environment. It's sort of in how they do their physiology. They can either shut down and stop growing, or they can grow really fast if conditions are favorable, or they can decide to reproduce. So they can decide to make flowers or make fruits and cones if they're pine trees. And so they're stuck doing something different than animals do. Animals generally move in response to the environment, and plants sort of have to either shut down and stop doing things or ramp back up.
Now, have you noticed anything, I would say, different or anything that seems like a little bit just out of place when it comes to just the observation of these things? Like, for instance, whenever you hear about an extinction event or a comet or asteroid, like the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, there was a megafauna that survived and all their life was wiped out. So plants, obviously, even though they can't really move and be able to, they have to kind of, I would say, adapt to their climate in a sense, if they can. I don't like the strongest will survive principle that a lot of people like seem to always talk about, like, oh, they'll adapt, and if they don't, they die off and we don't need them. That's not a good one. I like to have all these amazing things. People say the polar bears are dying. Oh, I like polar bears. You don't want them extinct. You know what I mean? But when it comes to plants, they're seem to be very, very durable, where an animal is very, very fragile. In a sense, obviously, when we're talking about a grand scale, like a giant impact or something. But if we talk about adaptations to their environment, animals adapt really, really well. In a lot of cases, there's a very few things that'll limit a plant to where it can't adapt anymore, such as like if their whole entire temperature climate gets thrown off, then they're kind of screwed. Animals, in a sense, as well, too. But animals have legs. They can move. They're not grounded into the ground. So it brings up, this is like where my thoughts go. It just brings up a weird question with our environment. There's a climate crisis that people keep talking about, and I'm wondering if you've seen any kind of change or variability when it comes to with these animals or plants.
Right. So those are great questions and interesting thoughts. And the real issue is we don't know very well how plants and animals are going to deal with rapidly changing environments. So my take on this is that environmental variability is just a natural fact of life, right? We all understand it. It's a part of how we live our lives. I live here in Florida, where lots of retirees come and spend the winters here, right? It plays a dominant role in their life, but it does for plants and animals too. Um, and the way I like to think about it is that for a long period of time, the regime of climate, so the kind of weather regime, how things go, how often droughts occur, and how frequently hurricanes occur, and big storms and snowfall events and those types of things. Those regimes, the frequency of them was relatively constant. So they can come, we're not really sure when a hurricane is going to come, but the plants that live in Florida are somewhat adapted to periodic hurricanes. And those things are happening the regimes of climate are changing now. And so there's a new frequency and a new intensity of weather events that plants and animals may not have any familiarity with, right? And so it's new to them and their biology. And so their biology may not be matched very well to it. They may not be adapted to these new types of events that happen. And so we're still trying to figure out who's going to deal well with those kinds of events and who's not going to deal well with them. You are right that animals can move, but in the migratory example that I gave, the birds don't wait until they run out of food and then they move. They move because they know the food is going to run out when the winter comes. So they move in advance of it. And the same thing happens with trees when they drop their leaves. They don't wait until the first frost to do it. They usually do it in advance of when it gets really, really cold. And so they have some cues that are available to them, which can be quite subtle, but we can pick up on a few of them. And the most prominent one we think about is that the cycle of sunlight availability, right? You pretty much know once the days get shorter, regardless of whether you're a plant or an animal, both plants and animals can sense sunlight. Once the days start getting shorter, you know that winter's coming, right? So there are some of these reliable cues that they use, and it could be that their cues no longer match the right timing of these important weather events that determine whether they should move or not. And so even though birds might be primed to migrate in advance of some oncoming bad event that would be bad for them,
Yeah, for
maybe
example,
it's coming a little bit earlier.
Well, for example, I have geese in my town, so I was driving and I just saw like this little pond, little thing. There was a bunch of things in the water. I was like, what is that? I looked closer. There are a bunch of dead geese. And that is because our winter was a little bit different. We had immediately a giant cold storm. We went from 60 to 20 to 40 to 50 to 20 again. And it was just these rapid changes. These things didn't know what to do. And next thing you know, some of them died because they didn't know if they should be flying away, if they should be staying. It seemed like it was shifting all over. Now, the environment aspect of things, you can easily point, like people always point at the sun or point at the heat thing. What I've been diving down and getting interested into is the aerosols or these other types of pollutants that we do from factories or cars or all these other things that we don't really pay attention to because we look at the grand giant enemies, which are like things that are heating up the sun. But these play an effect into our environment as well, too. With air pollution, if air gets thinner, it's harder to breathe. I live in a beach town, so I can smell salt air. But if I go into a city, it gets a little bit harder where I'm like, is my nose off? Is it COVID? What is it? Because I'm wondering why it's so much harder to breathe. That's why when you see on like a football game, you see the people on the football team in like Denver put on a mask if they've never the oxygen ones, the ones that get oxygen in them because they're not used to playing at that altitude. These are all varying changes in different environments that play effects that I think play a giant cause in a lot of like issues where you'll be seeing fluctuations and changes between animals and plants because they're small, but they're slowly building up. And you're getting to this point now, and I don't know how serious it is if there's dramatic changes and dramatic kind of scales you can look at to be like, hey, this is obviously impacting these a lot more than it's affecting these. But we rely on this thing where I feel like it forces, I wouldn't say an adaptation, I would say a mutagen. It forces animals to mutate to fix or form into their environment. Now, people call that adapting, but I call this being forced. So I call it a mutagen. We're forcing it in a sense with the pollutants and all these other aspects of things too. And I think it's causing a lot of fluctuation changes that I feel like will leak in. And I'm specifically talking about animals in this case, because that's the one you can really check. Reproduction, for instance. if you're in a climate where you're used to having your babies or kids and this type of thing, next thing you know, the air or the environment's thrown out of whack and it's different. Who's to say that those babies are going to survive those very early stages? Like when I was talking with Peter, he was mentioning that's a very crucial step in an animal's development, of those very soft and fragile like time period. It's like being a child. But then when you get older, you kind of manage, you're able to adapt, you're able to think more quickly. And that's where you'll start to see more change. And I think if that's more focused on or talked about, which maybe for someone like you it is, but for the general public, it's not. And that's why it's so surprising and interesting to me.
Yeah, so I'll say that so there's certainly lots of smaller changes in the environment that are due to kind of the activities and the emissions that humans have that pollute the environment. And those cause marked changes in the survival and reproduction of organisms. And so we can take just a generic pollution example. There's this classic example of adaptation of moths in Europe, where there was a bunch of, in the early 1900s, there was lots of coal that was being burned over there. And so there was ash that was falling on the trees. And that didn't, as far as we know, or as far as I know, didn't have any real heavy direct effects on the moths that were over there. But the moths over there are white, and they land on white trees and they spend their time there kind of hanging out. And the trees were mostly white, or they were gray in color. But when they were covered in ash, they turned black. And so now all of a sudden the white moths stood out and they were very apparent to their predators. And so they got eaten really fast, right? And we saw very quickly that the white moths, that really white moths started being replaced by slightly darker moths. And after a little while, there were mostly dark moths around. Now they're the same species, but they're slightly different colors. And then once humans in Europe started to get their act together and started to clean up some of that ash emission, then we didn't have so much ash on the trees, and then we started getting white moths back. And so the moths changed there, they adapted to that. But that's just sort of natural selection, and that's an example of natural selection, because the environment changes. It changes how many survive because they're being eaten, they're more apparent to predators. And then you get a different looking moth that comes around. It's probably also the case that when you have a bunch of pollutants in the environment, that it changes the rate of mutation of individuals. And so we might get more types of mutants that do better, and whether some of those are advantageous or not, whether some of those mutants do better in this new environment, I don't really know. It's a big problem. We don't have a lot of people working on it, but there are quite a few people working on it now. And we're trying to figure out whether we can observe changes in the traits of the regular species that are around us every day because of human activities.
Now, looking at it from a different angle, if we look at maybe that some species would have a more positive impact from like a little bit of pollutants when it comes to adaptability or maybe survival. Maybe they have to adapt to survive, and it's in a better aspect than what they were before. In a sense, that's good, and it'll probably be popularized on media, or it'll be cut out depending on which the narrative is playing, I would say. When I look at this aspect of environment, animals, plants don't seem to adapt as quickly as that. Plants adapt to I feel like plants adapt more from man-made actual interaction than they do with the actual environment changing. Like maybe a couple temperature degree shift, but if it's like a thing about the earth, like if one part of the desert, like Peter was talking about, where there was a flower and then it kind of changed, the whole landscape kind of changed over a long period of time, obviously, but when it changed, it's where we're at now. But if we look at like insecticides or pesticides that we spray on plants, for instance, we see a quick reaction in their change. We see, and that might be man also forced as well too, which would be like a mutagen. But there's obviously steps that we're missing. If you want to talk about that, we are basically poisoning our own food. But I look at it like, so is there a positive or negative impact that humans are having on their environment? Because I've talked to a lot of people who will tell you different sides of the argument. I'm just wondering, if it's positive or negative, is it positive and negative for plants at a larger scale, or is it positive and negatives on animals in a larger scale?
Well, it'll be positive and negative for different species, right? So you can think about much of the human activities have an enormous effect on plant distributions around the world. Just here in the United States, the vast majority of the Midwest was prairie, and so there were a bunch of flowering plants and things, and a bunch of grasses, and now they've all been replaced by agricultural fields. And so humans have had an enormous impact there. It's positive for the plants that we're growing for food because they're doing much better, right? They're much more abundant. They grow bigger. We select for them to do that. It's negative for a bunch of the native species that are around there. I will say also that for many of the plants we care about, they live a very, very long time. And so if you wait for them to adapt, you have to wait. Usually in evolutionary biology, we think it takes multiple generations. It can happen in as fast as one generation, but if we're going to observe it, we have to do it for a couple generations. And if you've got trees that live 30, 40, 50 years, after a few generations, you're talking about a very long time scale that's hard for us to observe. And so we're probably having lots of changes, but it doesn't happen as fast as you would observe for, say, like insects, which can do multiple generations within a single year. And so we might be able to see that much more quickly. This is sort of the problem with big animals like elephants and polar bears. Maybe they can adapt, but it's going to take a while for them to do it because they live for a long time and the environment keeps changing and we keep doing new things, and maybe they can't adapt fast enough.
So like for plants, for instance, if it's a long time period, I would say that they get to have life, some plants. If an environmental change does happen that isn't very, very drastic, if it's over a small period of time and they can adapt to that, is there a possible way that they would adapt a way to be able to sustain or reverse the way that their environment is going, like bring it back to what they were used to? Like there's a lot of people that talk about like with carbon emissions. I forgot what it is. There's something that you can plant that sucks up. I know they say trees store a little bit of that carbon emissions or something like that. But then when a tree burns, it releases it back into things. So it's kind of like a bank. It just storages it. Energy storage. I mean, that's a weird one in itself. I mean, I forgot. There's another thing that ends with storage. I'm blanking on the name of it. Oh. I'm not going to remember it. It'll come back to me after this podcast, I bet you. But we look at this storage effect. Now, is there a way? I'm not saying that humans can adapt or modify a plant to be able to store more emissions or do something like that. But is there a way, naturally or man-made, to be able to kind of find a way to modify a plant in a sense to where it can restore part of its environment? Now, we know about planting some species that can actually bring back some parts of the environment. I'm just wondering if that can impact other things as well too, when we look at a scale of like emissions, or we look at other things where we can actually use it to our benefit. Because I think the answer for so long has been trying to eliminate this. And I'm not a big environmental guy, but I've been getting interested into the topic. But when we talk about eliminating 100%, I don't think that's possible on anything, to be 100% honest with you, unless it's like an extinction event. But even then, we don't, as far as we know, it's an extinct species or something like that. Now, if we can't eliminate it 100% when it comes to emissions, is there a way to possibly manipulate it to where it's not hurting our ecosystem, but actually being beneficial and such? And I feel like that's a more productive discussion that's not really being discussed.
Yeah, so let's start with can humans plant certain things or favor some species that would alter the environment for others and restore them in some way? The answer to that is yes, very much so. And the simple example that's obvious once you hear it is that we think of trees as being the parts that make up a forest as being the habitat for lots of other species. And so we can, restore forest, and then lots of other plants that live in the understory of forest, lots of animals will come back because those animals view the other plants that make up the trees as their habitat, right? And so when they're there, they generate conditions that are better for lots of other animals and plants. And that's why we think things like tropical forests with their many giant tree species and all their structure is a great place for lots of animals and plants to be, because they make this enormous heterogeneity in the environment. That means it's good for some ants that are on the floor of the tropical forest, and there are lots of animals that go between the canopy of different trees. And so there's this enormous structure that's created that wouldn't be there as habitat if the forest trees weren't there. To your other question about carbon emissions and planting things that can sort of suck carbon out of the air? The answer to that is also yes. So our bodies are, I think the thing that people like to say is we're like 2/3 water or 3/4 water or something.
75%.
75%, yeah. So the rest of it is, the vast majority of the rest of that is carbon. And the same applies for trees, and it's for all living things. We're carbon-based organisms. And so when things die and they decompose, that carbon gets released back into the atmosphere. Um, and then as we breathe, so as plants breathe, they do their photosynthesizing thing, right? They take in carbon dioxide and then they make new material out of it. And then it gets transferred to our body. We store some of that, but some of it gets released as carbon dioxide too. And so plants, as part of their just regular everyday life of growing, they take up carbon dioxide from the air, from the atmosphere, and they make new tissues. And so the thought is, if we have, 100 acres of forest, and if we had 200 acres of forest, that's doubling the amount of carbon that's in trees and not in the atmosphere. The problem with that is that, like you mentioned, when trees die, they decompose and then all that gets released back into the atmosphere. And so unless we can maintain larger forests, that's sort of a short-term strategy that's not going to be particularly helpful. The real issue, as I see it, is that most of the carbon that's in the atmosphere right now that we're worried about, that's heating up the atmosphere and is responsible for global climate change, was at the bottom of the seafloor or underground for long periods of time. And we've pumped it out of the seafloor, and then we've turned it into fuel, and then we've burned it in our cars and burned it in plants, and then moved it from in the earth to the atmosphere. And so making more forests in general isn't going to solve that problem. We have to find some other way to put that carbon back somewhere where it's inaccessible and can't be part of the cycle of going into the terrestrial sphere. So that's where all the plants and the animals are, and then back into the atmosphere. The other big player here is the ocean. And the ocean is one place where people think that we can end up storing a bunch of carbon, because if things that die in the ocean, some of it gets eaten, but when it falls, when a whale dies in the ocean, it falls to the bottom of the seafloor. And if enough of that happens, some of that carbon from the whale ends up getting buried in the sediment. And so over long, long, long time periods, it turns back into the kind of oil reserves that we're out mining for in the ocean. That's a slow process, and we're trying to figure out how important the ocean is in capturing some carbon and then storing it at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, that ancient sediment. I know people talk about using that as like a fuel source. It's not a good one, especially because once it's gone, it's gone. It takes millions of years to build up a lot of that stuff as well, too. I had a guest on, Stephen Hunt, that told me all about that. I was like, oh, this is why people always reach out to like ocean people about aliens, because octopuses and all that's linked in as well, too. I just start looking at like, there's this idea, and I don't know how serious it is, because I wouldn't call myself a climate skeptic, but I'm definitely like, I'm trying to be sensible about it as well, too. You hear a lot of doom scrolling, a lot of fear on this aspect of that we're killing our planet. Is it to the extent where I feel like it's obviously not just us, and there's probably a lot of other factors that are at play, but we're definitely terraforming it. Now, my question leads to the aspect, are we terraforming it to where plants and animals cannot sustain life anymore in the direction that we're heading? And you can say the question of like, well, they are adapting to their environment, so it's not really, it might kill off some, but there are some that'll survive. Yeah, but for how long? And then we lead into this aspect of what can we do? I feel like there needs to be what Max looks at it from more of a spiritual aspect with our environment. I want to look at it in the same direction, but not spiritual, more like a combination of all these different living organisms being able to help out with their environment, to be able to set it or keep it at a base level to where we're not impacting each other in such a sense. But I feel like you have to have a reasonable connection with your plants and your animals, and a lot of people are cut off from those types of things as well, too. That's why it's interesting to talk to someone who studies both. Mostly because you're focused in something that a lot of people are like, I'd rather just watch Netflix. That's a common thing for a lot of people. I feel like if you had a better connection with not only where your food comes from, that's a start, but also the environment that you're living in as well, too. But, we're not really headed in that direction in a sense.
Well, we can start with some of what we know about the history of life on Earth. And the general thing is that, there hasn't always been life on Earth. It originated along 3.5 million years ago, and it's not always looked the same. And it hasn't always looked the same because Well, the environment changes. Sometimes the things that are there, the animals and the plants that are there, have effects on the environment that change um, what what kinds of things can live there. So for a long time, there wasn't a lot of oxygen on Earth. And then once we had some photosynthesizing things, once the emergence of plants, that made a bunch of oxygen available. And then it was okay for animals to be around, right? And we can look in the fossil record and see that there are marked shifts in the types of species that are around. And we associate those with huge changes in the environment. Now, it's hard to tell because, when you're looking in the fossil record, small spatial changes in where you find fossils correspond to very, very, very long time periods, right? Millions of years. And so we know that change has always happened on the planet at that scale. So we see that kind of change right now, right? We see rapid turnover of the kinds of species that are around. We see changes in properties of our atmosphere that are similar to the types of changes that have happened in the past. The problem is that that change is extremely rapid compared to others that have happened in the past. And we can link the fact that the change is coincident with the activities of humans. So that means two things. If we look at the fossil record, we know, well, if we take that same kind of approach, or that same kind of perspective where the environment's going to change and we're going to end up with a whole new set of species, do we want that to happen? We may want that to happen, but we're not very good at finding out what species are going to be around. There will be some life around. The Earth isn't going to be uninhabitable for all organisms. Bacteria are certainly going to do fine. There are going to be lots of insects and plants that do fine, but they're not going to be the ones that are doing fine right now. So our environment is going to look very different. And that uncertainty means it may be hard to have food. It may be hard to find shelter. It may be hard to find the things that we've learned over the past thousands of years as a human civilization works well for humans, right? And we see this a little bit now. People live on coastlines, and that's been a fantastic place for humans to live for the vast majority of human history. Most of human civilization has been concentrated near water because humans need water. Oceans and rivers are a great place to be. But here in Florida, if you're living near the ocean, it's actually a really terrible place to be right now because every 5 years or so, your house gets blown down. And that was a much less frequently occurring phenomenon even 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so we have to ask ourselves, if we're affecting the environment, are we affecting it in a way that's going to be advantageous for us? And the general perspective is no, because we've learned to do a certain set of things. We've learned to live our lives, and that's not going to be the way we'll have to live our lives in the future. We may run out of food. It may be harder to find food, and that's going to cause all kinds of crises in all different places. The other issue, and the one I worry about, because I really like the types of plants and animals that are around, and I like the kinds of environments that we have, is I don't want to see them go away. I like them the way they are. The kinds of environments that we shift to, that we've seen so far, are not near as interesting as the kinds of environments we had before. You get a very striking example in the desert southwest of the United States. Pictures from 100 years ago show that the desert was a much more lush place in places like Arizona than it is now. So I think Arizona is a fantastic desert to go and visit, but we already know that there are huge changes and it's hard to get back to that. And we just have to ask ourselves as a society, do we want to continue down that path or not?
Well, even if we look at the variation of animals as well, too, if you talk about a species adapting and changing, isn't that just a new part of the species? Like birds now probably aren't the same birds from 100 years ago. Now they might have birds in a sense like, oh, it's still a bird. Yeah, but I mean, it's technically we classify it differently, like another species or variation, just because it's got, oh, this insect, instead of having two stripes on its wings, it's got three. So it must be a different classification. But if we look at like not as extreme, I would say, as a desert environment like Arizona and what we've done to that, but look at an aspect of like animals. For instance, if you start seeing them adapt and they're constantly adapting and evolving and changing into something newer and newer and newer. Same thing with plants. How long until you can't eat the plant? You've adapted it so much with insecticides that now it's not eatable. So you have to go to a different type of plant. Then it keeps going and going and going and going there. I know so many times I've heard like, oh, you can't get tuna right now because tuna is so hard to get because it's not the season for it. Okay. When is that going to be to where you can't eat tuna at all? Corn, for instance, they have a lot of recalls on lettuce in the past couple of years. When is that going to leak into corn? When is that going to leak into other things because of either man-made change or environmental change, where it's caused something to shift, where now you have to look for a new food source? Then you start going into like, all right, well, now we can't get tuna, we have to get shark. Okay, well, how variable is shark? Maybe you can get a good amount for a good couple of months, but is it a year-round thing like we've been having? Do we need to mass produce it now? Do we need to genetically modify it? And that's where you might say, I'm going down the conspiracy rabbit hole. I don't think so. I think humans try their best to manipulate the food that they eat all the time, either to make it taste not like the thing that they're supposed to be consuming. People will modify broccoli to taste like a steak just because they can. Now, that kind of scares me a little bit, because I feel like there's a point where you're not going to be able to go back to the original. And people might say, well, if the original wasn't that good, then there wouldn't be modifications of it. I'm like, yeah, but we do that with our beef. We modify it to a point where, are we literally getting the essential nutrients from it? It's kind of like when you boil fish, you're losing some of those essential nutrients that are in that fish, rather than if you cooked it a different way. And it leads down to these things of like, is people paying attention to this type of stuff, or being aware of where we're pushing the goalpost? Now, people think that this line can easily be moved and drawn, and there's always another fix or something like that. Yeah, but I don't ever think we really head in that proper direction. I feel like if you start humans modifying animals to, or gene editing or something like that, it might be good at first, but is there a sense of going back to the original? Does something get lost along the way? What are they not telling you in that aspects? And I feel like that leads to people like myself asking someone like you questions about, the change, the environment, the shifts in it all as well too, boiling it down to the most common one that people can take example to, which is animals, but also being aware of the plant ones as well too. That disconnect that a lot of people have with their food and just their environment in general, these are the big factors that I'm worried about, which is why I'm trying to find out and get connected to it, because this is what it's going to lead to. Eventually, you're going to have just no meat at the store. People go, what? No meat? There'll always be meat. No, it's not going to be meat anymore. It's going to be a different form. And is that different form beneficial to you, or does it just fill the gap of being hungry? Are you getting the essential nutrients? How many people right now you could probably look at that are suffering from a nutrient deficiency? I heard so many people, vitamin D, vitamin B, any of these types of things that they used during the pandemic and started promoting. Will we be better prepared if maybe we got more of that from our food? How many people were getting that from their food? And now people just take supplements. Do you want everything to be dived down into a pill form? Well, this goes with genetically modifying things. This goes with changing our environment. Are we doing something that we're not seeing that has an effect? And that is the fact that we might be adapting, causing species to force adapt or mutate or try and survive, whatever people want to call it. And we're losing an essential aspect of what we got from them in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, humans have all kinds of effects on the environment that we haven't recognized yet and don't understand. And you can just look, every day I see, every week in the fancy journals in science, there's a new recognition that humans are having some effect on the environment that they didn't understand before. And so, the fish example is a particularly good one, because that's where the problem of food shortage is very acute, and it's very clear that we don't have as many fish because people have been fishing for so long and they fish so intensively, right? With the fish example, we know from kind of how fish live their life that many of them, especially these open water fish, when they're young and they're just, little fry, they spend their lives in a safe area of the ocean. Being out in the open ocean is not particularly safe. There are lots of big fish out there and predators out there that can eat them. And so the ocean currents often take these fish and they settle in seagrass beds or near coral reefs or something like that. And so that's an important part of the life cycle for many fish that we eat that are open water fish. And it could be that maybe we don't fish them so intensely, but if they don't have that habitat for this important young part of their life cycle, because we've dredged through a bunch of seagrasses, or the ocean's a little bit warmer and all the corals bleach and it's no longer a safe place for them to be, we'll run out of food. And that doesn't have anything to do with fishing per se. right? Those are other human activities that affect something we care about in an unexpected way. And so I think that kind of stuff happens everywhere. And it's very short-sighted on our part to think that we can always find another fix if we run out of a particular food source, because we just don't understand the world all that well. It's a big place and there's a lot of complicated things going on, and we're trying, but we don't understand it all that well. And it's also better from sort of a risk management perspective to make sure that there's a diversity of things and options available to humans. That's why I like to focus on what Peter and all of us in ecology call diversity maintenance. How do we keep a bunch of different species around? We know that those species have different properties. Some of them may be helpful for particular functions that ecosystems have, that environments have, and some of them may be helpful in another sense, right? And just indiscriminately killing off some of them because we want to put up homes or we want to put up shopping centers or something like that reduces the kind of options that we can use that nature provides to us. And so I think sort of as just a general prudent strategy, we should try and keep as many things around as possible, because maybe they'll be helpful for human endeavors in the future. Maybe there's some plant out there we don't pay attention to that has a chemical in it that can be used in cancer therapies. We just, we don't know those things.
Yeah, see, that's what I'm trying to get to is I think to sell the diversity or biodiversity angle of having a bunch of different species and having kind of like a wide selection, you have to look at the preparedness part. The strategy here is being prepared. See, if you try and sell, like you can have a multi-selection, I would say, or have this various amounts, people go, I like what I like. But it's like, yeah, but you got to look at from a preparedness aspect, if there is a global catastrophe. But I just wish we weren't at that red line all the time to be able to kind of take action in a lot of aspects. When there was the pandemic first started, everyone went to the store and got red meat. Red meat was off the shelves. You couldn't find it anywhere in my town, anything like that. There's a red meat scare. You can look it up. It's actually known as like a conspiracy thing because it happened right when the stimulus checks came out. So they were like, everyone used their stimulus check to buy red meat. And then they bought the new freezers that they were selling. And then the freezers, eventually all their food went bad because they never got to it, but they stocked up, and that's panic buying. People do that all the time. And I think we're getting to this point now where people like what they like, but they panic buy the crap out of it. In a sense of panic buy, doesn't have to be a necessary panic, just overbuying. And that's cause for more consumption. More consumption leads to more producing. More producing leads to the ends of the wires being kind of burned in a sense, where it puts more restraints on farmers and producers to make more yield or crop yield, whatever you want to call it. And that causes them to try and find a chemical that can produce it faster or modify a plant to move it faster. And that's when we start to get into this territory I feel like we should be more prepared for. And I feel like small steps that you can do is creating a more biodiverse environment. I talked to a guy named Curtis Kipp, who was working on an invention to be able to kind of produce your own in your town, like a New York environment, be able to have their own little farm system. And he's working on this project. He was given $2 million to do so because, like, I mean, in a sense, should you be getting this certain food that is not necessary to your environment all because that's what you want? Sure, but you can't just run your whole entire life off that. You should look at the bioavailability of what you can have in your area to also be able to produce your own food. So there isn't these giant restraints and these giant markers that get kind of cut over in a sense. I feel like that's an important thing as well too. I'm just down this rabbit hole right now where I'm looking at this thing of like, holy shit, there's like so much I was not thinking about. And I feel like when you talk about this stuff, and maybe I'm hitting a lot of questions that are off topic for you, but hopefully I'm trying to stay in the board range. But these are important things I feel like the public needs to know about as well too. And sadly, it's a very exclusive thing to know about this type of stuff because it's research. It's in your area of expertise when it comes to focusing in on this. And the general public doesn't know about it because you guys aren't getting on Fox News or CNN. What you're getting reported on is Russia or all these things that scare the crap out of people, and that's what I see the mismanage and misstep of being prepared is not really paying attention to these crucial aspects of stuff as well too.
Yeah, so I mean, we scientists, especially environmental scientists, have to do just a better job with public outreach and education and justifying what it is that we do and what it is that we've learned and get it out to the public. A lot of that happens in universities now, but it needs to start earlier. And we need to cultivate better natural spaces and explain why these natural spaces and the diversity of species that we see are valuable for humans outside of their intrinsic value. I really like just going to a wetland and seeing the kinds of plants and animals that are around. And I see that many people that go and visit those wetlands who aren't, environmentalists in any sense, they really enjoy it too. And so we need to have more of these spaces kind of available so that people can see the value in that. And then they'll be interested in learning about the kinds of things that I study and the kinds of things that we've been talking about on this podcast. The other thing you started this question talking about was what I would view as a trade-off between efficiency and what I call robustness. So there's this entire field of it's relevant in environmental science, but it also takes place in network science and people who are interested in social interactions and social networks, especially on the internet, which is called complexity science. So in complexity science, the basic idea is there are lots of interacting parts. So human societies have an enormous number of interacting parts, right? You make a part of the human society. I make a part of the human society and everyone around. So we've got, lots and lots of interacting parts. And there are businesses and there are government institutions and there are states and there are, all these things that interact with one another. And you can't do the typical science thing where we change one thing and ask what happens if we change one thing. It's too complex to do that. And so in complexity science, they try and look at big properties of complex systems, as they call it. Human society is a complex system. Ecosystems are complex systems because we've got lots of species of trees, we've got nutrients that are flowing around, we've got humans that are there, we've got lots of animals, we've got lots of different plants, right? And they're all interacting with each other in many different ways. So in complexity science, there's this idea that with some objective, like maybe how much food you produce out of an ecosystem, how much biomass is produced in an ecosystem, there's probably one way where you could select the right number of species with a minimum number of parts that makes it extremely efficient, right? You find the plant that grows the fastest and you find the pollinator that pollinates that plant the best, and then you find the particular nutrient concentration that makes the plants grow the best fertilizer for them, right? And that would be a very efficient system because you can have lots of food very fast. This is what you were reminding me of when you were talking about finding better ways to grow, bigger cows and have better meat for people and more meat available. But when you do that, you trade off against what's called robustness. Those kinds of systems are designed to work very well for one particular thing, in one particular context. If the context changes, like if there's a pandemic, right? All of a sudden that no longer works and you're left with nothing because the system's designed to do one thing. So in ecosystems, what we see is generally they're not particularly efficient when compared against the most efficient ecosystem we could design, but they're robust. They work pretty well in all kinds of different contexts. So if there's a big storm, if it gets warmer, if it gets colder, if a new species shows up, those systems are very robust. And I think in complexity science, there's a recognition now that we should design our economic systems, we should design our food systems, we should design our political systems, not to be efficient, but to be robust so that they can still work when we have disruptions. Like our economic system, our global trade system is very efficient, but it's not very robust. And we could see that during the COVID pandemic. All of a sudden, we ran out of lots of things that we needed because we had this very special part that was produced on the other side of the world and we couldn't get it there, or we could get it here, but because there were short delays everywhere, it ended up being an exceptionally long delay for the final product, right? And so you can only get this one part from one place far away. And so if there's a problem making that one part, then the entire system kind of falls apart. And so I think we should be thinking more about making our food systems more robust. One way to do that is to have a local garden, right? To have local farms that supplement foods that are produced that you might get from faraway farms, right? So you can have an efficient source, but also a sort of conservative and consistent source of food as well. And that kind of system is much more robust. We also see this robustness idea comes up for plants and animals that live in environments that are quite variable. Because the environment varies so much, they can't be good at doing one thing. They have to be sort of okay across a broad stretch of different environments. And so the individuals, the organisms themselves, are complex systems made up of different tissues and different cells that are all interacting with one another in different life stages. But their adaptation, selection has shaped them to be robust, not particularly efficient. I don't know, have you come across that idea before of robustness and efficiency?
Um, the more conservative aspect you were talking about, that's kind of like Hurst Kip's idea in a sense, not really with people producing their own kind of farm in their backyard, which I think that's where I was thinking that he was talking about it. More like government kind of like community things, like community gardens and that aspect of things as well too. But I look at this like I think this is just a problem with managing at scale. It's kind of like having rules for we instead of a rules for me type thing. Like each individual state has their own laws and policies in a sense, like when it came to the mass thing. But what about if we just do that with farming as well too? We base, like if you look at energy, for instance, if you go to energy.gov, try and look for renewable energy, it says it's nuclear. But when you look at like the problems and all the issues that they talk about, they go, well, this one you can't do water because the cost and all this type of stuff. But what they're basing it off of is a dam that was built in China. And I'm like, why are you basing your information for here off of China's data? Like, you got to look at where your environment is. So, if your environment is such, you should be regulating as such, which I think instead of managing at scale, we should just manage and maybe cut it down to split states or not trying to divide people up more, but just more like you understand your environment in Florida better than I do. I understand my environment in Maryland better than you do, only because I'm around here. I'm experiencing it every single day. I know what needs to be fixed. I know all these types of things. I feel like if you look at it from that aspect, and you could do that with anything, our economy, you can do that with so many things. Instead of managing off of how other people are doing it or this template that seems to be fixed in the sense of, oh, this is the most effective overall for everybody. It's like, is it though? Because it seems like it's going to one class over the other a lot more. And you start realizing is that like maybe there's an incentivization when it comes to cash, but when it comes to our environment or food production, for sure, I feel like you can do a better job at you're involved in it. Like if I'm gonna figure out scientist stuff when it comes to anything about science, I want to talk to that scientist who's in that field. But you have companies and corporations that are making the rules on farming and all these types of things instead of talking to the actual producers and trying to find the more effective way. And I feel like a lot of that when it comes to our food production, for instance, is not only it's forcing manipulation more and more and more because of the amount of people that just want more and more and more. But it's also an aspect of there's a lot of people not just disconnected from their food, but disconnected from the farming thing as well too. These farmers are trying to produce a massive amount of crop that's almost impossible unless it's all by machines. Now you're causing them to cut corners. It's causing them to not paying attention to these slight details that eventually affect the overall population. So I look at that like, is there a fix there? I'm sure there is. Are we going to pay enough attention to it? Probably not. We can try. I feel like that does come for what you were saying before about not just being taught in universities, but being taught at a younger age as well, too. The issue that I have with the younger generation, these people that call themselves like, you see the people with these giant rallies, like, don't cut down the tree. I'm going to tie myself to it. And they tie yourself to one tree and then they go pull down or bulldoze the other trees down. The issue I have with those kids are they're not doing it properly. They're way too aggressive on it. Now I get the aspect of trying to save the environment because it is a red line type thing is how they're being told. I just think there's a more effective way to do that. And I think that does come from you are playing a chess game. We are in a chess world. Everything is done with plans and moves, and everything is strategically done to make sure that the other person the own person profits and the other person doesn't, because nobody's paying attention to what the other person wants. They only care about what's intent for them. So I look at it from, it's not about communism. It's not about getting together with all your friends and, we're all going to benefit. We're all going to be a shared group, but it's about making strategic plans in effect of a bigger cause, which is the fact of the human species. Is that going to go in a positive or negative route? I mean, I've talked to people that'll tell you people shouldn't have kids because human race just needs to die off. I don't think that's the right route, but I understand the concept of it because you look at all the other factors of the environment that play into our lives and what makes up our own lives. If all the plants died and all the animals died, we have nothing. That is an important thing that we need to pay attention to. You can manipulate it as much as you possibly can, but when does it become the original thing anymore? That's I don't know, an important question. Maybe I'm crazy and I'm down a dark rabbit hole, but that's it.
Yeah, well, there are costs and benefits to everything. And right now, we've decided that the short-term benefits of still burning fossil fuels outweighs the long-term costs that might come from food shortages in the future, right? And so this is the same thing with what you were talking about, having a diverse set of different farming practices that are locally. There are costs and benefits that come from those kind of decisions, and some people will benefit and some people will not benefit. Some organisms will benefit from a particular practice and some will not. And my perspective on this is that we need to take longer term cost benefit analysis into account, because we've almost always as a society decided that short term costs and benefits are most important. If we want to make sure that we have food in the future, that may mean that we have to pay some costs right now, right? And people don't like to hear that. That's the central idea behind, saving up for retirement. You're taking a cost right now while you're making money. You're not getting as much money as you could be making, so that you can have a benefit longer term down the road, so that you can have a life for yourself.
It's called return on investment.
Return on investment. That's right. So you pay a short-term cost and you get some benefit later on. And I think that's the basic issue with climate change policy right at the moment. And for many environmental issues, many of the environmental benefits are longer-term benefits, and many of the benefits to manipulating the environment, destroying the environment in some way, come with short-term benefits. Right, a developer buys some land and they can make some money pretty quick relative to the benefits of having that forest around by putting in a housing development or putting in a shopping mall or something like that, right? And the same thing happens in all kinds of contexts. And I think we need to take a longer term perspective, and humans are just really bad at doing that, right? It's a really common problem for people to not want to invest as much in their retirement as they could be, right? Even if they find out that, say, their employer will pay just as much as they're paying it, so they can get free money, but the money comes later on down the road. People will still take the money that they have right now. We're very short-sighted. We're very short-sighted beings, and that's sort of by design. For a long time in human history, we only had to worry about making sure we had food today, shelter today, safety today for our family and for our children and for ourselves. We didn't need to worry about what was going to happen in 20 or 30 years. But it's a new thing for humans, and we have to come to terms with taking a longer term perspective on the activities that we have.
So I'm just going to toss a ball out into left field. What do you think about algorithms? Do you think that we can somehow get to a point where algorithms or AI, I've talked to guests in the past to talk about they can be used for environmental purposes as well too, either being able to find problems or being able to manage and find a more effective way to be doing what maybe we want to be doing, more responsible, more ethically responsible in a sense, but also with animals as well too. Are you able to have a machine run that as well? Not when it comes to we're eating machines. I mean, like machines running that business of producing, for instance, running it in a more effective way. Like I never liked Wagyu. I think it's stupid as hell to like popular or I guess treat a cow like it's royalty, and then the last like minute you kill it, like just the meat tastes better. Like whoever did that study is insane. But I look at it like with AI or these algorithms, I think that could be very, very beneficial in correcting us in a lot of our actions as well, too. I think a lot of this where we are now and a lot of situations that we're in, I'm not saying like, oh, the human race is the worst thing in the world. No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying we're doing pretty good, but we could be doing a little bit better. And I think that does come with an aspect of having our oversight be checked, not by other humans, but by something that can actually check every single possibility rather than just the perspectives that you have in your own head. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? You think it could be a positive? You think it could be a negative?
Well, I think just like anything else, AI is a tool. And so used in the right context with the right frame of mind, it can be beneficial, but it can also be used in harmful ways. So, AI is just a bit outside my, it's a bit outside my area of expertise. But my understanding of AI and machine learning in general is that it's a way in which you can design computers to do pattern recognition, right? Humans are pretty good at doing pattern recognition. We're fantastic identifying people's faces. We don't know exactly what it is that we're picking up about a person's face that distinguishes them from another person. But we're really good at identifying faces. I hear it all the time. Someone says, I'm good with faces, but I'm not good with names. And they're recognizing patterns in people's faces. And so there's something about the aggregate characteristics of someone's face that our brain is really good at identifying. But there are other kinds of patterns that we're not great at identifying. And AI, in general, can identify patterns. The problem with AI, and where we run into trouble using AI, is that there's a certain set of patterns that we can map into the AI algorithm that it can identify that's biased based on the person who's designing the program. So this is a big problem in these kind of predictive tools for economic or health in economic situations or in health situations. So some people are keen to use artificial intelligence to identify people who are going to be have some disease, or they're more likely to make a lot of money, or they're more likely to be criminals. But those have biases.
Fairness.
So those are biased because there are biases that are built into us as humans and the data that we collect that goes into those algorithms, and they show up. And so taking the perspective that the algorithms are sort of agnostic and they have no bias, and that they're just doing prediction is a bad way to do things. And so I view AI and machine learning as a tool to identify patterns. And we have to ask ourselves and do the hard science after that. Do we trust these patterns? What do the patterns mean? And where might they come from? Now, there's a particular algorithm that's not generally viewed as an algorithm that's present in the environment at all times. And that algorithm is natural selection. It's evolution by natural selection. That algorithm optimizes a particular objective, which is fitness of organisms, their survival and their reproduction. So what we see around us is, up to this point, the species that have survived and reproduced consistently. If they stop surviving and reproducing, we don't see them anymore, and so they get culled from the algorithm. And oftentimes, fitness is optimized, or there's the objective for increasing fitness is done in a particular context, and so we can learn a lot from the way that organisms work to see, is there a specific way we can design machines for a similar objective. And so, like, seagrasses are really good at buffering coastal ecosystems from the effects of hurricanes. And seagrasses, for them to survive, they have to not be ripped out of the ground, out of the bottom of the ocean when a hurricane comes through. And so we can learn a lot about the way that seagrasses work and design possibly some artificial things that go on coastal ecosystems to buffer those communities, the people that live there, from intense hurricanes. I think that I can't think of what the name of the field is, but there's an idea of designing by looking at nature. Nature's had lots of time to try out different options, and the best one for a particular purpose has sort of come out, the best that within the set of options that was available. And so maybe we should design things more like the way things look in nature, and they'll be pretty good at doing that particular job.
Or even my thought was like the possibility of checking you said a natural one, which is natural selection. But if we look at a way of animals evolving, but checking all possibilities to make sure that it's more beneficial to the overall species than negative in a sense as well too. I think an algorithm that might have all those different ideas and a probability type thing where it keeps spinning and checking all the possible number of outcomes based on the environmental aspects as well too. We can look if it needs to be implemented or we need to fix what that environment is first. I think that's a major thing as well too. If we look at it from like not looking at a grand scale, but tackling one thing individually, if we check different environments, let's check Florida. If Florida has like, well, the environment's causing the animals to go in this direction, so maybe we can play a hand, but we can also wait a couple of years. Let's look at the ones that are going to prioritize first, the ones that need to be fixed right now, so we don't get an Arizona instance for some reason.
Yeah, and I do some of that. I do some of that in a computer, checking lots of different possibilities and seeing what the best is in a particular environmental context. The problem with doing that in general is that we humans are just limited in figuring out what all we need to include, right? If you put all possibilities in a computer, at best, what it's doing is trying to replicate what's going on outside our houses, right? And so we have to winnow it down a little bit, and we're never going to do as good a job representing nature as nature itself. And so that's the idea behind looking at the way organisms are structured internally and how ecosystems are organized with all the different plants and animals that you can find there and bacteria that you can find there, and asking how does that work? And can we design our human systems in a way that works similarly and that performs similarly for a particular function?
I'm going to ask you one last question, and this one's
Yeah.
going to be a really, really far left field one.
Okay.
Oh God, I'm gonna blank on the freaking name again. It's what the Jets, the people, conspiracy people, chemtrails,
Chemtrails.
bad
Yeah.
or good?
I mean, those are
That's got to
contrails
be
as best I
messing.
can
That's got
understand
to
them.
be messing with some migration patterns, bro. That's got to be.
Um, so I think the bigger issue with migration patterns is light and noise. So humans make an enormous amount of light, right?
Noise.
Our satellites, yeah, we make an enormous amount of noise as well. So it depends on how the organisms move and they migrate. But for birds, right? Birds use visual cues, they use magnetic cues, and they use all kinds of different senses of their environment. They might use some predictable aspects of atmospheric um, weather patterns. I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me if that ended up happening. But the biggest thing in the visual cue front is that there's an enormous amount of light at nighttime, when historically, for the vast majority of the time that the birds we have now were living on Earth, there was no light at nighttime, right? And that's got to do something. We know that that does something for sea turtles. Sea turtles, when they're babies, and they come up, right? So um, sea turtles, the mothers come up onto the beach, and then they dig a hole. They lay their eggs in a nest. They cover it back up. And so if you go down to some Florida beaches the right time of year, there are these flags that mark off, don't go here because there's a sea turtle nest. The sea turtle eggs hatch. They crawl up. They do it usually very early in the morning. They crawl up out of the sand, and then they head for the ocean. And since they do this at nighttime and when the and early in the morning, the sun's coming up, and it comes up in a predictable direction because the sun always comes up in the same place, right? And they've been cued to start heading towards the light because that's where the ocean is. If they're on the east coast of the United States, if they're on the west coast, they go the opposite direction. But because there's all these lights now in developments on beaches in Florida, the sea turtles go the wrong direction. They're attracted towards the light. And I'm certain that I wouldn't be surprised at all if there were similar things that disrupted migration patterns of uh, birds and visual creatures. So the same kinds of problems happen for things that live in the ocean that use sound as a way to navigate. There's a bunch of noise pollution in the ocean, and that can disrupt navigation patterns of marine mammals that use an enormous amount of sound to get around.
I can't believe you just put the image in my head of a freaking 10-speed bike running over a sea turtle. Damn. Um, Yeah, there's a lot that you got to pay attention to. It definitely can make a bad case for the human species, but I also think there's plenty of positives out there as well too. I just think we have to try our best to be prepared on a lot of aspects of these things as well too. It's why most of the talks need to be done in a more general discourse rather than just one-sided. You know what I mean? There's a lot of that's not happening properly, and I think that comes with better education as well too. I think there needs to be an open access for people like yourself, researchers in the field that are working on different various things out there, be able to talk to the general public. And as much as you are doing as much as you possibly can to, there just needs to be a open platform when it comes to giant things that people are constantly looking at. CNN and all these other places, they don't show that type of stuff really. There are plenty of other podcasts that focus specifically on these business CEOs that are able to investigate the farms themselves and be able to talk about it. I really appreciate you giving me your time, Nick. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Yeah, they can search for my name. My website is nickkortessis.com. That's NickKortessis.com. Or you can Google my name and it'll show up.
Well,
thanks for having me. It was enjoyable.
Yeah, you're welcome back anytime. And thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.